There is a sound that stone makes just before it gives. Not a crack, not a break. Something softer than that. A kind of settling, a release. Like the stone has been holding its breath, and the chisel finally found the line it was always going to follow. A mason learns to listen for that sound. It takes years before you hear it clearly, or years before your hands know the difference between a cut going right and a cut going wrong. The hammer doesn't tell you. The chisel doesn't tell you. The stone does. Stand in front of a dry-laid fieldstone wall, somewhere in rural Pennsylvania or Vermont, somewhere it's been standing since before the Civil War, and press your hand flat against it. Feel the weight of it, the silence inside it. Every stone in that wall was red before it was placed. Someone held each one, turned it, considered its grain, its density, its natural cleavage lines, decided where it belonged, then cut it to fit. No mortar, no adhesive, just geometry and judgment. That's what traditional hand-cut masonry was. Not just construction. It was a conversation with material, conducted over decades, through mentors and apprentices, through calloused hands and eyes that had learned to see what others couldn't. If you've ever looked closely at old stonework, really looked, you know there's something different about it. Something deliberate. This is the story of that skill. Before any tool touched it, a master mason read the stone. Granite, limestone, sandstone, bluestone. Each one different. Each one with its own internal logic. A grain structure running through it the way wood grain runs through timber. Cut with the grain and the stone splits cleanly. Cut against it and you lose the piece. Cut at the wrong angle and a stone that took an hour to prepare fractures in the wrong place. You cannot learn this from a diagram. You learn it by ruining stones, by feeling the vibration travel up through the handle when the hammer strikes, but by watching a more experienced mason do the same cut and noticing that his angle is slightly different from yours. By asking why. By being told. Watch the color change near the edge. That's where the stress is moving. This kind of knowledge has a name in craft traditions. Tacit knowledge. Knowledge that lives in the body, not the page. You cannot write it down completely. You can describe it, point toward it, demonstrate it, but the student has to find it themselves, through their own hands, through repetition, through failure. That's what an apprenticeship was for. A young man would begin by carrying stone, fetching water, cleaning tools, watching. Weeks would pass before he was allowed to make a cut. Not because the master was withholding, because watching was learning, because the eye needs to be trained before the hand. The toolkit of a traditional stonemason was not large. A steel hammer, sometimes several, different weights for different cuts, chisels of varying widths, a pitching chisel for rough shaping, tooth chisels for intermediate work, a drove chisel for finishing flat surfaces, now a punch for fine detail, a straight edge, a square, a set of winding sticks to check for twist, a line and pins for keeping courses level. That's most of it. Maybe someone in your family worked a trade like this, or kept tools like these on a shelf in the garage, and you never quite knew what they were for. Some of these tools were old when the men using them were young. A good hammer handle was shaped to the grip of the mason who owned it, worn smooth in the places he held it, balanced in a way that felt personal. You didn't lend it casually, so that you didn't replace it unless you had to. The relationship between a craftsman and his tools is hard to describe to someone who has never had it. It's not sentiment, it's function. A well-fitted tool extends the hand. It becomes part of how you work, and not separate from it. There are several basic operations in hand-cut stonework, each one a skill in itself. Scapling, rough reduction, removing excess stone quickly. Drafting, cutting a precise line along an edge to establish a reference plane. Boasting, working the face of the stone to a consistent texture. Tooling, finishing work, smoothing and refining. Each cut is a calculation. How hard to strike? At what angle? How many passes before you check your progress? When to stop? And then there is fitting. In dry-laid construction, walls built without mortar, the fit between stones has to be close enough that the structure holds under its own weight and geometry. The mason looks at two stones together, sees where they don't quite meet, marks the high points, and removes material from those spots. He checks again, removes a little more, checks again. This is not fast work. A skilled mason building a dry-laid wall might set a dozen stones in a day, each one considered, each joint tested, the wall rising slowly, course by course, and as each piece finds its place. If you've ever watched hands move with that kind of patient precision, you know it's different from watching a screen. There's a quality of attention in it that's hard to name. In the old tradition, a mason's day started with the stone, not with the plan, not with the schedule, with whatever piece he was working, where he left it the night before. Morning light was useful. It showed the surface texture more clearly, cast shadows into small irregularities that afternoon light would flatten. An experienced mason might spend 20 minutes in the early morning just looking at a stone before touching it, planning the cuts mentally, locating the grain, deciding where the waste would come off. Then the work began. The rhythm of hand masonry is slow and deliberate. Hammer rising and falling, short breaks to check the line, longer pauses when something didn't look right. The experienced craftsman trusted these pauses. Something in his peripheral vision or his fingertips had flagged a problem his conscious mind hadn't fully registered yet. He learned not to push through that feeling. Where are you watching from? Are trades like this still practiced anywhere in your area? There are more places than you might expect, though fewer every year. Afternoons brought different challenges, where fatigue changed the strike. A tired arm hits differently than a fresh one. Experienced masons knew this and adjusted, saving detail work for the morning, doing roughing out in the afternoon when precision mattered slightly less. A master mason understood more than cutting. He understood load, how weight travels through stone, how an arch distributes force, how a keystone locks everything else in place, not through adhesion, but through compression. The arch trying to flatten itself, every stone pushing against its neighbors, the whole system holding because it has nowhere to go. Modern structural engineering can calculate all of this. Precise load calculations, computer modeling. But the traditional mason arrived at the same understanding through a different path. Embodied, empirical, accumulated across a working life. He might not have been able to write the equations, but he could look at a proposed arch and tell you it wasn't going to hold. And he'd usually be right. By the mid-20th century, the conditions that had sustained traditional hand-cut masonry were changing. Concrete became cheaper than cut stone for most construction purposes. Pre-fabricated stone components could be ordered and installed without the specialized skills that cutting required. Diamond saw technology, when it arrived industrially, it allowed stone to be cut faster and more consistently than by hand. These weren't failures of craftsmanship. They were changes in the economics and logistics of construction. Builders needed to build faster, at lower cost, as at higher volume. The tools and methods that supported that shift won out. The masons who had built careers in hand cutting didn't disappear overnight. Many of them transitioned, doing restoration work on old buildings where machine-cut stone didn't match the original, or specialty work for clients who wanted the traditional look and could pay for it. Or they stayed in their trades until retirement and left behind workshops that closed quietly. Have you seen a workshop like this close in your lifetime? A building that was just there one day, and then not? A sign taken down and replaced with something else? The apprentices stopped coming mostly, not because the trade was forgotten, but because the pathway that had led young men into it, family connection, local need, visible opportunity, had narrowed. A young man in 1955 who wanted to learn a trade could find a working mason nearby without much searching. By 1985, he'd have to look harder. By 2005, harder still. Some of this skill still exists. There are working stonemasons today who cut by hand, for restoration, for high-end custom work, for the preservation of historic structures that require period-accurate methods. Organizations focused on historic preservation have, over the decades, worked to keep these skills documented and sometimes funded. There are schools, a handful of them, mostly in Europe, a few in the United States, where traditional masonry is still taught in a formal setting. The knowledge hasn't vanished, but it's held by fewer hands than it once was, and the natural transmission system, the apprenticeship, the workshop, the daily proximity of experienced craftsmen and beginners, is largely gone from the mainstream construction world. Do you think skills like this should still be taught? Not to replace what we have now, but to preserve the understanding, to keep the knowledge somewhere other than old photographs and footnotes. The stones themselves still stand. That's part of what makes this particular trade different from some others. The work of these craftsmen is still visible, still functional. The dry-laid walls running across New England hillsides, the carved limestone facades of 19th century courthouses, the fitted granite steps worn smooth by generations of feet. These are not artifacts behind glass. They are still in use. A mason who spent 40 years cutting stone by hand carries something in his body that can't be fully transferred to another person by description. He carries the memory of 10,000 strikes. The calibrated sense of how hard to hit, when to stop. Knows where the stone is going to break before it breaks. He carries the patience that precision demands. The willingness to go slowly when going slowly is what the work requires. That knowledge lives in his hands, and hands do not last forever. But the walls remain, and the walls remember what the hands knew. Under this video, there's a subscribe button. It's a small action, but it helps keep stories like this alive. If craftsmanship still matters to you, if you believe skill deserves to be remembered, subscribing simply means you want these trades documented while they're still here. And before you go, tell us where you're watching from. Is there still a stone wall in your town that someone built by hand? A mason still working? A restoration project keeping these skills alive? Have you lived this life or watched it fade? Share your story in the comments. That's how these trades stay visible.